Okay. Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about work package 1 or a part of the project. Can we move on to the next slide, James? Okay. So basically, we're just going to present quickly the main questions and some of the things we're doing in parts of the project. And we have formulated this as two key questions that we're trying to answer. So the first one is, what is the state and changes of primary forest in Europe, and how do they differ from managed secondary forest? And primary forest here are largely unmanaged or largely unaffected forests by modern forestry, and likely or hopefully also that they have seen limited impacts in the past from direct human impact. And the second one, what is the current status of secondary forest in Europe, their stand age and composition? So next slide, please. So about the first one, about primary forest, they can be used as a baseline for states and changes in forest with no direct human impact. So basically, they represent the natural processes and the natural states in terms of the amount of trees, their size, soil carbon, and dead wood, and so on. And by comparing them to managed forest, we can get a picture of sort of the impact of management over a long time. So these graphs just show two hypotheses and how they can be used. So in the first one, we're seeing a primary forest in equilibrium with the environment that is not really changing, and perhaps an upward trend, so a carbon sink in managed forest. And in the second figure is another hypothesis or another illustration, basically showing that both ecosystem types are perhaps changing over time, and that the managed forest may then still be different from the primary forest. It could have more carbon and perhaps a larger trend, or less carbon and a lower kind of uptake trend. And this is then on the y-axis carbon storage, for example. So an upward trend would be an uptake of carbon. Next slide, please. So basically, what we're doing first here, because we know so very little about primary forest, their location and their state. So what we're doing first in this project is looking at carbon storage in the forest and basically asking, is there more or less in this primary forest than there is in secondary forest? So you can move on, James. This will not tell us about the slope of these curves. It means it will not tell us anything about the uptake over time, but it will tell us about the states, which we think is one of the key kind of missing information we have about this forest. So next slide. So what we do, this is an example from Sweden in this work package, is that we basically map the forests, which we have done in Sweden, and we're doing it in other parts of Europe. And then we do a paired analysis. We basically compare, we go and visit, we do field inventories in this primary forest, and we compare to secondary forest around them. So this mapping and inventories is a key aspect in the project. And these are sort of the kind of results that we expect to have. So on the left graph, we have carbon storage in vegetation in primary forest on the x-axis and secondary forest in the y-axis. So in this case, we see 1-to-1 line, and then we have a 2-to-1 line and a 4-to-1 line. So in this case, we can see that these primary forests store about 2 to 4 times more carbon in vegetation than the secondary forests that are growing in the same kind of region do. In the second one is another example that we look at drought impacts. So we look at satellites, and we can use that too. So once we have these maps, we can extract data. And in this case, we're looking at the dry spell in 2018, also only for Sweden. And we compare again the forest in these pairs. And what this figure then show, for example, is that soil moisture is very important. So the topography. So we have soil moisture class 5 is the most moist, where we can even see a green up during dry conditions because there's enough water and so on. And perhaps also the evaporation cools the atmosphere. And then when we move to dry classes, we see larger and larger impact. This is not very surprising. But what we also see here then is that, for example, the impacts of these primary forest or in the primary forest during the dry spell was overall smaller than it was in the secondary forest. Yes, so I'm going to hand over to Paloma now.
Okay. We will work with National Forest Inventory data. This information has been already gathered in previous projects as the Tree Mold and the 4MMI. As you can see, we have quite a wide and broad latitudinal gradient across the entire Europe of data. And we have obtained in this project some more countries as Ireland and others only with one inventory, as for example, Italy. We have data at tree, plot, and grid level, and it's true that the sampling protocol and the time between inventories varies, but we are already getting some further information, as in the next slide, where we can you can observe from this previous project of Susan Subanto how harvesting intensity, the frequency and the mean intensity has been calculated across entire Europe using 11 countries. If you continue passing the information, the goal from this information is to generate a pan-European map that will be further used in the modeling part of the project, and we will also be used to better understand empirical relationship, as I will show later on, between management, carbon storage, and biodiversity. The second pan-European map that we are planning to do is about the stand age, as we can see in the next slide. And we are, as a first step, Julian is going very deep into the National Forest Inventory data to see how reliable is the information about the stand age in the different forest inventories. This is some of the countries we have been already looking into the information, and we will combine this also with other field information data to see if we are able to generate this pan-European map to be further used in the modeling working group. So with the National Forest Inventories, as we can observe in the next slide, we are updating data about biomass across the entire European gradient. This is a map from the first harmonization some of the people in this working package were involved in, as Miguel and myself. And with this data, we can calculate very precise information about the stand structure and diversity, and we are planning to use this data to calculate how carbon and diversity might change depending on management and climate in the project. And to finish, we are starting to have, if you can go a little bit on, yes, like that, thank you, James. We are starting to have some very in-depth discussions because we are also very interested in understanding how management might interact with climate, forest structure and diversity, leading to differential demographic rates for the many species in Europe and changes in composition and biomass. So we are starting to do some empirical analysis here. And thinking how theoretical we can include this in this theoretical model. So this is basically what we are doing in this first part at the European level.